Dr. Edin is one of the nation's leading poverty researchers, deploying ethnographic observations, in-depth interviews, and mixed method approaches to the domains of welfare and low-wage work. Also, she is the co-author of the recent book, $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America. So, without further ado, let's give Dr. Kathryn Edin a super fantastic Seattle welcome.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I have to say, a little backstage moment, that I've done over 100 public presentations in the last year, and I think this conference is the best organized I've seen. So thanks to all of the organizers for putting their all into this convening, so that the presentations you will hear are really not one-offs, but they're meant to be a conversation that moves you from one point to another in a narrative that you can write the ending to in your own practice. Maybe I'll start by telling a story, because every research project sort of has an origin story. Some of you may know that in the early 1990s, my dissertation advisor talked me into spending my 20s, yes, my 20s, running around the country and interviewing low-income single mothers about their budgets. Now, this is in the time prior to welfare reform. Welfare reform occurred in 1996, so this is in the late 80s and early 1990s. And after interviewing hundreds and hundreds of single mothers in locations across the nation, one gets to be a little weird. You know, personality tics do emerge from that kind of an experience. And so my personal tic is to always be thinking in the back of my mind, how do they make ends meet, right? I'm thinking about what their income is and what their expenditures must be, and I'm trying to figure that out. I try not to sort of intersperse that into dinner conversations, but sometimes I can't help myself. So put that into the backdrop. After writing Making Ends Meet with Laura Lane, the book on single mothers' budgets that was published in 1997, I went on to study other things, family life and neighborhoods. And it wasn't until 2010 when I returned to study the lives of the deeply poor. It was actually a study of the transition to adulthood. I was at Harvard at the time. The study brought me to Baltimore, where a large federal experiment had taken young people who had been born in public housing and given some of their parents vouchers and some not, and so they'd moved across the metropolitan space. Virtually all of them remained deeply poor in young adulthood. And so what we wanted to see is what it was like for deeply poor children who had lived lives of significant disadvantage to make that transition from adolescence to young adulthood. You may know that most of the literature on this topic is really about middle-class adults, and so we didn't really have a national picture. So that's what I was supposed to be doing in the summer of 2010. So I moved to Baltimore for that summer and began interviewing these kids, these young adults by this time. We'd been talking to them throughout their lives. We'd been following them over time. And I'll never forget the day that I parked on Madison Avenue in front of the Latrobe homes. We were going to visit Ashley. We knew she was 19 years old. We knew she was the mother of a new baby. We hadn't checked in with her for quite some time. And so as we knocked on the door and she opened it, the first thing I noticed is that she seemed visibly depressed. She wasn't able to, wow, that's interesting, a haunted conference room. She wasn't able to sort of make eye contact. She was visibly unkempt. And the most worrying thing of all was that as she passed this 2-week-old from shoulder to shoulder, you know, that instinctive thing all parents do, right? They put the hand behind the head. And Ashley was not doing this. So we went into the house, and I noticed that there was virtually no furniture there. There was a trash-pick couch. I remember a single bed with a filthy, fitted Bugs Bunny sheet torn in one corner. I remember a table with only 3 legs, useless, pushed up against the wall, a single chair. And Ashley sat on that chair with the baby, and I sat on the floor. And just by virtue of luck, this gave me a perfect view of the kitchen cabinets, because in the Latrobe homes, like in a lot of other public housing, there are no doors on the cabinets. So, of course, what is in these cabinets? Nothing. And as I began to interview Ashley more, I learned there was nothing in the refrigerator either. Most worryingly, no baby formula. So I abandoned my questions on the transition to adulthood and began asking her about how she made ends meet. And I was stunned to learn that although this family had a housing subsidy, there was no source of cash income coming into this household at all. Nothing from work, nothing from Social Security, nothing from TANF, the new name for welfare after 1996. So you never know when an epiphany is going to come, and this was truly a moment of epiphany, although I didn't really realize it at the time. I thought to myself, is it possible that in the aftermath of welfare reform, a policy which had been judged a success by both the left and the right, that a new form of poverty had emerged in the United States, a poverty so deep that we didn't even know it existed, and in fact so deep that we hadn't even thought to look for it. So I kind of put that insight into my back pocket. But I did say something to Ashley as we were leaving. I gave her the $50 that we customarily give folks in respect of their time. And I said, Ashley, I think I have more questions for you. Can I come back tomorrow? I was concerned about her and the baby, wanted to make sure they were okay. And indeed, the research team returned the next day. And you can imagine how stunned we were when Ashley met us at the door. She had gone up to the little beauty shop and gotten a home perm. She actually looked terrific. She had walked down Broadway Avenue to the local Goodwill store, and she'd bought herself a used pantsuit. She was wearing that pantsuit, and I kid you not, she was making eye contact. She had a spring in her step. She proudly announced that she had deposited the baby with her mother, and she was on her way out to look for a job. $50? So a second thought occurred to me, and again, I didn't quite take it seriously at the time. And it was this: I have been aware of the work of my colleague Robert Moffat, a very famous welfare economist. And what he has showed is that we actually spend more on quote-unquote anti-poverty programs than we used to. But over time, more and more of that money has gone to the second fifth of the income distribution, to the so-called working poor or near poor. Less and less has gone to people at the very bottom. And most of what people at the very bottom get is in kind and not in cash. And that is true here in Washington State. So the second part of the epiphany was this: could it be, in the world's most advanced capitalist nation, where we don't have a barter system like much of the third world, much of the developing world, I should say, that there was something truly essential about cash that could make the difference between a despondent young woman who seemed so depressed and unmotivated she could barely get out of a chair, to somebody who was able to find the determination and the confidence to go out and look for a job. So again, I kind of put this epiphany into my back pocket. I finished my interviews on the transition to adulthood, and that book just came out this spring. We just presented it at the University of Washington a few weeks ago. It's called Coming of Age in the Other America. But in any case, I finished that research. And it wasn't until I went back to Harvard that fall that, again by luck, a young number cruncher by the name of Luke Schaefer happened to be visiting Harvard as a visiting professor from the University of Michigan. Now, I had actually agreed to sponsor Luke as a visiting professor, but I had frankly forgot he was coming. So he showed up at in my office at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning, eager to begin. I knew I was supposed to know who he was and what he did and what he was doing there. But I didn't know enough to know that he was the expert on in fact, possibly the nation's expert, one of the nation's experts on the one data set that could tell us better than any other whether what I'd observed with Ashley was a one-off or a trend. So to cover over my confusion, I quickly told him the story of Ashley, and he said, I have just the algorithm already prepared. All I have to do is change a few things. I can tell you the answer to your question. Now, in my memory, I thought he said tomorrow. He says it took a week because, quantitative people are always trying to convince qualitative people that they work harder than we do. So we can't agree on this part of the story. So he tells it his way, I tell it my way. But I think both of us were stunned by the chart he came back with. This is literally what he carried to my office a day, possibly a week later. Now, we had chosen $2 a day for a very important reason. Okay, all poverty thresholds are arbitrary. But when you're going to use an arbitrary number, it is always best to use somebody else's arbitrary number rather than your own. So, of course, $2 a day is a well-known rubric that the World Bank uses to measure extreme destitution in the developing world. So we borrowed that rubric. You can change the threshold to $1 to $3. The story is very much the same. But if we had written the book $3 a day, I might not be here with you, I suspect. In any case, what we were measuring was households with virtually no cash income at any given time. Okay, this is according to the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which captures more of the income of the poor than any other government survey, and is less hit by declining rates of response. So those are technical details. We can talk more about those later if you're interested, probably in a sidebar, because most folks don't want to know the gory details. What we found is that in 1996, on the eve of welfare reform, we did have about 600,000 families in the US at any given time reporting incomes that low, but by 2011, that number had risen to over 1.5 million households with over 3 million children. Now, we also imposed in a paper that followed immediately upon the book a stricter test. We followed children over time to look at spells. Turns out you can't follow families because they're too unstable. The household roster is too unstable, so you have to follow kids. And we only counted kids who were in households that had at least 3 months in $2 a day poverty and had no substantial assets. What we found in that analysis is that at any given time, roughly 3.2 million children in the US are spending at least 3 months in a calendar year with incomes of less than $2 per person per day. Half of those, a little more than half, 1.7 million kids, are in households that experience at least 7 months in $2 a day poverty over the course of a calendar year. Now you might say, well, is that big or is that small? We spend about $70 billion, many, many times over what we spend on TANF, on tax credits, as you all know, to lift the incomes of the extreme poor, the earned income tax credit in its state counterparts. That program lifts about 3.2 to 3.3 million children out of poverty every year, if you count it as income. So what we see here are the two faces of welfare reform, if you will. We see some folks whose parents are able to find full-time, full-year work. They're benefiting from these credits enough to push them over the poverty line. But you see another group of people who are not able to maintain full-time, full-year work, and really there is no cash safety net left for them at all. And so they're falling further behind. Here in Washington state, for example, if you look at the poverty rates in 1996 and 2014, what you see is a fairly steady rate of poverty. It goes up and down, but we're at about the same level we were in 1996. But the number in deep poverty in this state has grown substantially. You had about 30 30,000 families in deep poverty. That's less than half the poverty line. In 1996, you have a little more than 50,000 today. So there is this growing heterogeneity at the bottom of the income distribution, with some families sort of treading water or even getting a little bit better off, largely because of tax credits, and other families really falling into abject poverty at levels we have not seen in modern history. Now, numbers only take us so far, and I will tell you, if you go to our website, $2aday.com, we have ad nauseum milked every data set, administrative and survey we can find in the nation to document this trend. It is all over the place. But numbers only take you so far. You can't know from the numbers what the texture of living in $2 a day poverty is. And so we decided that the best way to continue our investigation is to return to families like Ashley's. See if we can easily identify such families over time and follow them. And indeed, we picked 4 locations. We started in Chicago. I like to think of Chicago as the quintessential American city. Maybe those of you in Seattle would disagree. But we began there. We then wanted to find a city that had been a boom town during the time when Michael Harrington wrote The Other America and Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty. The business boosters of Cleveland used to call it the greatest location in the nation. Now people say other things about Cleveland. But as we know, those cannot be true. I've just spent the last 4 summers in Cleveland. It is a great town. But indeed, it has really hit the skids since 1965, one of the poorest cities in the nation. We then wanted to find a place that had been deeply poor in the 60s, but had since seen a rebound. So we chose a part of Appalachia that had gone from being one of the poorest places in the nation to sitting at about the nation's average. Johnson City, Tennessee, and its surrounding area. And then finally, we wanted to find a place that had been deeply poor in 1965 and continued to be deeply poor at present day. And so we chose 2 little hamlets in the Mississippi Delta. I will tell you, we did have to change the name of the county and of the towns to protect the identity of our respondents, which by law, researchers are required to do. So if you say, gee, there is no such town named Percy, you are correct. All right, so what did we learn? Now, in these ethnographic explorations, we identified 18 families. We followed them for many, many months and years. Indeed, we're still following several of these families. Our goal was to develop a series of hypotheses about how people fell into extreme poverty. And what came out of our work was a 3-legged stool of causality. So let's go to leg 1, the death, the veritable death of TANF. Now, we've got some criticism for saying TANF is dead. I believe that's the name of the chapter. But the reason we say that is because it is so thoroughly and completely dead in the minds of the respondents that we spoke to. But the numbers also tell that story. On the eve of welfare reform, we had about 5 million adults on welfare. I just talked to Don Oleruck at HHS, and he says this slide is now out of date. We are down to 850,000 adults. 850,000 adults across the whole country who are claiming TANF at any given time in the most current year, well after the recession, 2014. Half of those are just 2 states that are kind of unlike the national story. Unfortunately, Washington State is not one of those states. They're California and New York. Half of all TANF recipients, adult recipients, now live in those states, meaning that all across this country we have only about 400,000 adults left on the TANF rolls. So the TANF to poverty ratio, which is kind of a rough estimate of the proportion of eligibles who are getting the benefit, right? The proportion of poor families that are touched by the TANF system, that used to be in the late 1970s, about 80%. It was down to about 2/3 at the eve of welfare reform. It is now down to about 20%. Here in Washington State, You were at about 120% on the eve of welfare reform. You were only down to about 67% in 1999, prior to seeing the economy for low-wage workers tank. But you're now all the way down to 33%. You're still above the national average. But in addition to your caseload decline, the value of your benefits in real terms since 1996 has declined by 35%. So even families getting TANF in Washington State are getting a value that is far less than they would have under the old system. So the numbers are boring. The stories are more interesting. I would say the numbers are essential, sort of hangers for the stories. But as I said, nowhere was TANF more dead than in the minds of our recipients. So I vividly remember hanging out with Madonna Harris and her daughter Brianna in Chicago. On a weekend, they had been living across a series of homeless shelters, each of which had strict limits on how long you could stay there. It was the weekend, so the shelter had no feeding program. The residents were on their own. Brianna and Madonna had nothing to eat, and I finally broke. And I said, why don't you simply go down and apply for TANF? I used, of course, I can't remember what the Illinois abbreviation. Each state has its own name for its TANF program, so I used the Illinois name. And Madonna just looked at me like, what is wrong with you? And she says, well, haven't you heard? They're just not giving that out anymore. Now, Madonna was in a network of folks that were fairly poor, but no one she knew of was claiming TANF. Similarly, Luke and I were visiting Travis and Jessica Compton in Johnson City, Tennessee. They had been 3 months without income. Both of them worked in the fast food industry, and their hours had been cut to zero because of the seasonal nature of the tourist trade there. There were no jobs in Johnson City that they could at least qualify for in the winter. They were literally on the verge of eviction. And as Travis was talking with us, he was literally standing by the window, keeping his eye out for the sheriff's deputy in case that deputy would come and evict he, Jessica, and their 2 daughters, Rachel and Blythe, both 2 and 4 years old. So Luke finally says to Travis, what about welfare? Travis looks at Luke point blank and says, what's that? Travis has never heard of the program. Again, in a network of folks that are fairly deeply poor, but no penetration of TANF in that extended network. Finally, in Cleveland, Ohio, we met a woman who had heard of TANF. Her name was Ray McCormick. She had been in and out of $2 a day poverty since she was about 12 years old when her father died, and her mother abandoned her in the apartment in Johnson, while she ran off with a lover to the Tennessee mountains. Ray has an incredible story of how she survived in a home alone with only her father's Social Security death benefits to support her, and how she kept safe by acquiring a pit bull named Sweetie. But in any case, when Ray had resisted applying for TANF for years because she really prided herself as a worker and really saw herself as somebody who doesn't take handouts. And when we finally observed her going to the TANF office and coming back empty-handed, you know, we said, well, what happened? And she said, oh, well, they told me, you know, there was so much poverty, so much need in the area that there wasn't enough money to go around, so I should come back next year. Now, by our research, that state was sitting on $1 million TANF when that surplus when that statement was made. Ray has applied 3 more times. She's kept a detailed diary of each of these applications. She is still not on TANF, despite the fact that she's been without any source of cash income now for 4 years. And we're getting more and more reports across the country of what are known as informal diversions, really pushing people off of the door, sort of capitalizing on the fact that they're ashamed to go there anyway, and keeping them from applying through these soft tactics. So if you look around the country, you see stark evidence of this. The way TANF is being applied is not at all what you read on the books. And in many states, that TANF to poverty ratio is in the teens or even the single digits. And this is particularly, of course, in the Deep South and in the mountain states. So that's leg 1. Leg 2 is work. You might think that the $2 a day poor are a group of people who are deeply disconnected from the world of work, sort of an underclass, living in a world that is very different from our own. But as we began to identify families across the country, we found people with significant work histories. So we went back to this survey of income and program participation to examine the penetration of formal sector work in the lives of the deeply poor. And so again, we followed children over the course of a year, and we compared the deeply poor to the just plain poor, to all poor folks. And so first of all, we see almost no penetration of TANF in these families' lives, but we see a high degree of penetration of formal sector work. So what this chart does is it identifies every child for whom there is an adult in the household who is in the formal sector labor market for at least a month over the prior calendar year. Now, people often say to me, we need to separate out the generational poor from the working poor, as if those were two different groups. What this evidence shows you is that this is largely a myth. 90% of children living in poor households see an adult go to work at some time during the course of a year, and 70% of kids in extreme poor households. So what we see are adults hanging on to the ragged edge of a labor market that is literally collapsing within their hands. The bad jobs of the mid-1990s were simply much, much better than the bad jobs of today, and you can really see that in the statistics. The tragedy, of course, is that in most states, the TANF to poverty ratio remained fairly high in the 90s when the economy was good. Most of the decline, especially here in Washington State, has actually been since the economy started to hiccup for low-wage workers in 2000. And we've seen almost a continuous decline with just a slight exception during the Great Recession. So what is work for the extreme poor? Why is it so perilous? What are the sources of its instability? Susan Lambert has also done beautiful work on this from the School's Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. But among our families, we saw unsafe work conditions. We saw a violation of labor laws. We saw work hours fluctuating in ways that families could predict. The central dilemma, and you can see this in labor market statistics, was the almost inability to find an employer that would give you full-time hours. But along with the expectation that you would only get to work part-time was an expectation that you would be available sort of limitlessly. So very hard to take a second job, even if you could get one. Two stories come to mind about the first about unstable work, and that comes from Jennifer Hernandez. So Jennifer Hernandez was mother of Caitlin and Cole. She lived in Chicago. She, too, when we met her in the summer of 2012, was moving through a series of homeless shelters in Chicago. She'd finally landed in a shelter, kind of an unusually good shelter, that had managed to offer a program to folks who were able to find work within the 3-month limit that they allowed people to stay. If they found a job within that time, they could get a 1-year housing subsidy. So they could get an apartment in the private market, but only pay about 1/3 of their income toward the cost. So Jennifer was super motivated. She literally, we watched her all through that summer pounding the pavement along the Clybourne corridor on the near north side near where the shelter was. Finally, literally, okay, on the last day that she was eligible for this voucher, she was about to be kicked out, she got a job with Chicago City Custodial Services. And this started out to be a great job. She got paid more than the minimum wage. She got almost full-time hours. She was cleaning corporate apartment buildings in the Loop between tenants. She loved the feeling of making things shine, the visible sense that she'd made a difference that day. But as the Chicago winter approached, you know about Chicago in winter, right? It's real. The contracts in those corporate apartments faded, and the only contracts that Chicago City Custodial Services could get were cleaning foreclosed homes on the south side of Chicago in preparation for retail. So, of course, the winter is advancing. The crew is going out. They've got warm water in buckets in the back of the van. They get to the place on the south side. They have to unlock the padlock. You know, the whole thing, of course, has been encased in plywood, so there's very little light inside. They never know what they're going to find. Will it be, you know, wildlife? In Jennifer's words, a drug den. She came across a couple of those. Wood scrappers have broken in and taken out everything of value, leaving a mess and gaping holes in the wall. They never knew what they would find. But as they scrubbed in the cold, because we know that foreclosed homes lack three things: water, heat, and electricity. So as they began to clean these homes in the cold, they would quickly run out of water. The water would become filthy and black. They'd pour it out. And then they'd have the challenge of where they were going to get water. So sometimes they would knock on a neighbor's door. You know, this was a deeply shaming experience, as you can imagine. Or they'd skulk in, you know, at the McDonald's to the restroom, kind of hiding their buckets so they could fill them up, or at a service station, and they would come back and do more. Jennifer showed me her hands right after she ended up quitting this job, and I'll tell you why in a second. And they were literally scarred from all of the cleaning solvents that she used. But worse still is that Jennifer was a severe asthmatic. And so as she worked in these moldy homes with all kinds of other toxins that you can imagine, lead and so on, she began to get sick. Her children were also asthmatics, and it engulfed the whole family in a cycle of illness. So what ended up happening, of course, is that Jennifer's hours were reduced in punishment for the fact that she was no longer deemed a reliable worker because she'd called in sick a couple of times. So her hours get reduced from 35 to 30 to 25 to 25, and then to 10. And finally, she decides she needs to quit the job, get well, and search for another one because she has only 3 months left of that one-year housing voucher. The other thing I want to say is that oftentimes, and we all know this to be true if we work with folks who are on the margin, unstable work intersects with unstable personal lives in ways that produce a sort of toxic alchemy. So Ray McCormick is a great example of this process. She's now, when we meet her, she's in 2012, she's sort of living, 2013, she's sort of living with this group of unrelated adults. They've all sort of chipped in to be able to afford a bare bones living in a largely abandoned house with only one working electrical socket and no water coming into the house except for a broken pipe in the basement. So they're hauling water from the basement. They have no cooking facilities inside the house. They're literally grilling on a grill in the backyard. And Ray, though, has got this job at Kmart. And she loves this job. She's been working there for about 3 months. They've never given her full-time hours. She's only allowed to work 27 hours a week, and she's still at close to the minimum wage. But nonetheless, she's devastated when Super Walmart comes to town and shuts that facility on West 65th Street down. So Ray decides she's going to make her future at the Super Walmart. So she gets a job as a teller, and she arrives to work, and she notices that there's an incentive program, the Employee of the Month program, and she sets her sights on winning that contest. So as she works as a cashier, she notices that unlike Kmart, Walmart has produce. And this is what's really slowing cashiers down. So she begins to keep a little pad by her cash register, and every time a produce item comes across, she writes down the number on this pad. And then she will go home at night, and she would record these numbers on the recording device of her phone. She'd put her earphones on, and as she slept, she would put that recording on continuous play. As she said, my subconscious did the job. So sure enough, in the first 6 months, she is named Cashier of the Month twice. So we come to month 6. She's feeling pretty good about this job. Again, She doesn't have full-time hours. She's still living in this very precarious situation. She is giving over about half her income in order to obtain rights to the car. There's one car between all of these people. She's just used the last of her wages to put gas in that car on a Friday. On a Monday, she gets in to go to work. The gas tank registers empty. It turns out that 2 of her roommates have run errands over the weekend, and they've driven up all the gas. So she runs into the house. She grabs her cell phone, and first thing she asks is, what happened here? Does anyone have any money? I got to get gas in the car, and no one has a cent. So she calls her manager in desperation. She says, can someone give the 2-time employee of the month a ride? Or maybe a loan? She's not going to get paid again for a couple of weeks. And of course, the manager's got 100 other workers with less complex personal lives waiting for a raised job in a city like Cleveland. And he says, if you can't bother to come in on time, don't bother coming in again at all. So this reflects this intersection, but also sort of a fragmentation, an alienation in the relationship between the employer and the employee. The third leg of the stool is unstable housing. By definition, virtually all of the families in our study were either homeless or precariously housed. The only exception to that was Paul Huckweiler, who owned his home. And so what we see are families consumed by this process of moving from shelter to shelter, was the case with Madonna and Jennifer, but more commonly, moving from one unstable, precarious double up to another. Now, we often think quite benignly about doubling up, but if you look at it close up, you'll discover quickly that no landlord wants a subfamily in his or her unit. Runs up the water bill, landlords are responsible for water. It can be the difference between making a profit or not for a property owner. Landlords are often vigilant and will evict a tenant who is sheltering another family in the home. So many times these double-ups were very short-term, and moms were able to exercise very little discretion in where they laid their heads at night. So in the book, we talk about one particular double-up that Jennifer Hernandez landed in, where her daughter Caitlin was raped. Ray McCormick, who lived in countless precarious double-ups, I think we counted 24, between the age of 12 and 22, which is how old she was at the study's end, says matter-of-factly of these arrangements, I've been beat, I've been raped. As we began to get into this data, we discovered the literature on adverse childhood experiences, which of course follow folks in to later phases of their lives in ways that are very deleterious to well-being. And we found that in our stories, children and adults were experiencing ACEs at much greater rates while in these precarious double-ups. Now, most of $2 a day is about how people survive. And I'm not going to tell you the answer to that question because I want you to buy the book, and I want to sign it for you and have a conversation with you about what you do and how what we do might be helpful to you and vice versa. But I will say that folks demonstrated incredible ingenuity and grit in deploying these survival strategies. Often survival was really a full-time job. One of the most common survival strategies, actually the most lucrative one we documented, was selling plasma. So we have a great story. It was excerpted in The Atlantic about Jessica Compton and her plasma sales. Plasma in the United States has grown exponentially as an industry since the mid-1990s, when we first started collecting data on it, from about 5 million donors then, 10 million donors then, to 32 million. Currently, the United States is the only country in the nation that allows people to give as much as 2 times a week, other countries deeming it too physically deleterious. We create so much plasma as a country, we are known as the OPEC of plasma. Over 60% of the world's plasma comes from the United States. And we have now mapped every plasma clinic in the country. And as you can imagine, they are overwhelmingly located in low-income neighborhoods. So what do we do in response to $2 a day poverty? First, our safety net as currently construed is predicated on work. If you work full-time, full year, and you take advantage of those tax credits, you will be better off than you were prior to welfare reform. You might be better off than you'd been at any time in modern history. Now, you won't be rich. You will hover just above the poverty line, but you will not be in official poverty. However, if you're not able to do that, we really have no safety net to catch you when you fall. And in many places in the country, full-time, full-year work simply has very limited availability. Check out the Brookings website on this point. It is really quite striking how we make a safety net based on the expectation of work, but we give people no guarantee that they can work if they want to. So we have 14 specific policy recommendations in $2 a day, but I'm just going to outline 4 general principles here. First, all deserve the opportunity to work. We need to expand the private sector. We need to expand subsidized jobs to get more formal sector employers into the business of employing low-wage workers, and we probably need jobs of last resort. Second, every family, every parent should be able to raise a child in a stable place of their own so as to avoid these adverse childhood experiences. And third, we need to recognize that work is not going to always work. There are going to be times when family illness or a shock to the economy limit the number of jobs available. And we do still need a functioning safety net. Expanding the child tax credit would be one idea. It's going to be very, very hard, I think, to fix 10. If we're about to come out with a proposal, you can read about it in the New York Times on Tuesday, for bringing in, I think, a quite affordable proposal to instigate a guaranteed child allowance across the population. But whatever we do, we need to adhere to the following principle. So as Luke and I traveled across the country interviewing and following these families over these many years, Luke would always ask one question. He'd say, so, you know, Travis, if you were to really feel you were making it, that your life was going in the right direction, what would that look like? And to a person, these families had astonishingly, maybe depressingly modest dreams. They'd say, well, $12 an hour, 40 hours a week, or 35 hours a week with benefits, year-round work, as if that were some, mirage, right? Far in the distance, this unattainable goal. Travis actually wanted 14. He was at the margin of that little experiment. But what families wanted more than anything else was a chance to feel that they were contributing, that they were members of society. And this is why they wanted to be workers so badly, and why work was so core to their identity, and welfare such an anathema. Right? Work in the United States, whether we like it or not, is citizenship. And so when we asked folks what they would do if they had the magic wand of the policymaker, not a single person said that they wanted more handouts. Virtually everyone, in fact, everyone in our sample said what they really needed was more work. And at the root of what they were trying to communicate to us was this deep need to be included. Every society draws a circle, and we put some people on the outside of that circle, while other people are allowed to be on the inside. And they felt very strongly that they wanted to be on the inside of the circle. So in the end, we proposed the following litmus test for any policy or program, profit, for-profit, nonprofit, government, going forward. And I'm going to expand on this in my workshop this afternoon, so that'll be kind of part 2 of this talk. Does it serve to integrate or isolate the poor? Does what we're doing bring people inside of that circle, or to use T.H. Marshall's powerful imagery, does it force the needy to trade in their sense of citizenship, to cross the road that separates the citizens from the destitute? in order to get those services we have on offer. So I'll stop there, and I will welcome your questions.